Hello, everybody, and welcome to the badEM podcast. My name is Daniel Still, and I'm your host. badEM stands for Brave African Discussions in Emergency Medicine, and this is a platform we use to try and find African solutions for African problems. This episode, I'm delighted to chat to one of badEM's original founders, Jo Park-Ross. She is a paramedic by trade, and after many years on the road and in the air, she has transitioned into medical education and is now the director of the SHARE initiative, which stands for Simulation in Healthcare for African Research and Education. She is also a senior lecturer at UCT's Health Sciences Department, and she's currently completing her PhD, exploring how people build sustainable and high-impact simulation programs in Africa. In this episode, we talk about what simulation is and how beneficial it can be when done properly, as well as touching on the many areas it can be applied where it traditionally hasn't been used in the past. We then move on to the broader topic of open access medical education and resources, and how the world is starting to think differently about knowledge, monetization of knowledge, and appropriate setting-specific resources that are accessible and affordable. Welcome to the show, Jo. Would you start by introducing yourself and giving us a brief background of your career so far?
Thanks, Dan, for having me. My name is Jo Park-Ross. I'm one of the original founders of badEM. I'm a paramedic by clinical background and spent my clinical career working across sub-Saharan Africa in both ambulance and aeromedical services, including some time in clinical governance and training. And I had the pleasure of developing a aeromedical simulator through some grant funded work. And I've been at the University of Cape Town for 5 years, building simulation faculty development programs and simulation programs within our university, and as the co-founder of the African Simulation Network with my colleague Marvin Janssen. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you founded the African Simulation Network. Tell us more about that.
We started something called the SHARE initiative at UCT, which is Simulation in Healthcare for African Research and Education, as a way to just pull some focus and resources towards building opportunities for people interested in simulation. My experience of starting out in sim was, it seemed like a good idea, so I gave it a go. But there is, in fact, a lot of research and methodology around how we're supposed to do things like set people up for success and how we're supposed to debrief. And our experience of connecting with the international simulation community, both in high and low resource settings, and with our African colleagues, was those resources are expensive and difficult to access. And we thought that we could do something about creating a community that solved that problem.
Awesome. So you've been at UCT for 5 years, you said?
Yeah, exactly 5 years.
When did the SHARE initiative start?
So we launched the SHARE initiative in 2023. And so far we have a very active research component. And part of that is I'm doing a PhD looking at how we build successful simulation programs in our setting. We run various faculty development programs, both in person, and we're developing some online programs just to make it more accessible. And then we run a network. So the network's quite informal, and we're building towards a society for African simulation. Now it's a pretty informal space for sharing and supporting and really cheering each other on. At some stages we have sort of 1,500 people on the WhatsApp community, and we think that we're represented in between 35 and 40 African countries.
It sounds like you're growing pretty quickly. Before we carry on, for those who are not actually familiar with what simulation is, would you mind giving us a brief definition, if you will, of what is simulation and where it can be used? A lot of people think of it as purely as similar to what gets done at ACLS, etc. But as you have already alluded to, it can be used in a variety of ways, like debriefing and more communication-based situations.
I love that you think I'm going to be brief when talking about my favorite thing. Thanks, Dan. I think that simulation is not about a technology. Simulation is a technique. And simulation is the practice of learning from a replicated clinical experience, like a scenario, through reflection, which is the debriefing part. So that's kind of the more theoretical framing. I think that within medical education in definitely South Africa and maybe across the continent as a whole, we very traditionally are expecting to have an instructor put us through a scenario and then give us feedback, when in fact debriefing is meant to be learner focused. So we're meant to ask learners about their experiences and help them reflect on their own performance and how they'd like to improve, and help them to translate knowledge into practice. One of the things I think is really interesting about simulation in our setting is we're really limited on the modalities that we use. So simple tabletop simulations with printed out medical equipment and people that move across a printed out map of a ward, etc., are well used in other settings and are low cost. We're seeing virtual reality being used in some systems to orientate new staff members to their own clinical spaces, perhaps a little out of reach of most low resource settings. But it's also the act of just teaching us how to interact and communicate with each other, both in terms of patience and with how to work better as a team and how to lead better as a team, and how to deal with our performance under stress is something that we're particularly interested in. I think some of the more interesting things that I've seen come out in the past few years have been pieces of equipment, so mannequins, not dolls, please, which look more like people, like the people that we're wanting to look after in our health settings, and a lot less like a skinny man. We did some interesting research last year about, how few mannequins have breasts, how few mannequins are people of color. And so I think that that's one interesting part of it. And the other is using digital or other modalities to teach people de-escalation and communication skills. Some of the high-income country settings have quite good proof that the better we communicate with people, the more honest we are, less likely we are to get sued. And I think that knowing the proportion of the South African government's bill that we spend on medical legal claims, perhaps, this is a way to make things better. Testing systems is also a favorite, where people test new facilities, new programs, new equipment, and use simulation for quality improvement.
Yeah, and like you said, it's testing things in a safe environment.
Yeah.
And sometimes testing things in your own practice, which might be very entrenched, before you actually evaluate your own performance and are forced to consider how you might have done things differently, or how you could improve in some areas which you may not have been forced to reconcile with before.
Yeah. So we have a few core concepts in some of the faculty development courses we teach, and one of them is about psychological safety. And one of the main parts of creating a psychologically safe learning environment is creating a space where people feel safe enough to venture a challenge, to challenge the instructor, to challenge a colleague. And I think that that's a really exciting thing for me, is that so much of feedback is one directional. Whereas if we're able to open a conversation in a way that people feel free to explore. I mean, I'm always joking with my registrars about, I'm inviting you to make errors here. Please come in here and try something a little different. Let's make mistakes here where you're safe from harming a patient. And I think our medical culture really is against that idea that it's, we're not fallible.
And I like how you said that good communication and trained communication can benefit everybody from the beginning, from you and your own personal experience to the patient's experience to your ultimate chance of getting sued. And obviously, everybody makes mistakes, and it's another practiced skill almost to learn how to deal with those mistakes once they are made.
Yeah, I think just demonstrating a learning culture is the most important thing. There's a wonderful leader in the simulation kind of research field called Jenny Rudolph, and her famous quote is, "Mistakes are not crimes to be punished, but puzzles to be solved." And so she comes from the Center for Medical Simulation at Harvard, and they developed for us the basic assumption. And so you start a simulation session by saying, I believe that everyone here is capable and we're here to learn and do our best. And I think that that's a beautiful kind of contract you make with someone to say, that is my assumption of you.
Yeah. And you're not going in with any preconceived bias or assumptions about people's skill or competency or what they can or cannot do.
Quite the opposite. I'm going in with active curiosity, and I want to make sure that I understand you, not that I come in with, and sure, I've been challenged plenty by people who have, not everyone is ready to engage in that kind of an interaction, and that's okay.
Agreed. Tell us a bit about the courses that you run for simulation, as well as the instructor courses. I know that you have just come back from Ghana and you do them in various other African countries. So tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, fresh off a plane, so an overnight plane. So sorry about all the slurring. We had the privilege of having an overseas course run in Cape Town between 2014 and 2016. But we realized that cost was prohibitive. And so we designed our own, which we launched in 2022. So it's a 2-day in-person course called the Simulation Launchpad, which is a UCT short course. And we cover everything from how simulation can be used to designing and debriefing simulations. And then on the second day of the course, we run, debrief, and then debrief the debrief and reflect on the experience of running simulation. For many of our faculty, for many of the people attending, this will be their first exposure to simulation in that format. And I think it's quite an interesting thing. So there's a few things that it brings out. One is we have to bring front and center the idea of psychological safety and people being curious and being inclusive. So justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion is one of our core principles. And it's fascinating to me how challenging people find this new thing. They are an established and well-known specialist in their area, and here they are being challenged to learn a new skill, which feels very uncomfortable, and it can be quite an emotional and transformative process. So at the moment, that's our main faculty development course, is this 2-day simulation launchpad. We also run a 2-day debriefing masterclass where we teach kind of different theoretical models. So the main model we use is called the Pearls model, only mentioning it because they have a whole wonderful website where you can read up about it and download lots of learning resources. And then we are in the process of starting some online courses. So one which will be just 4 modules and very accessibly priced. And then a longer simulation course, which is 3 months online, and a longer debriefing course, which is 3 months online. And we think that this is an important step for us because it helps to cover this knowledge gap. We need this kind of advancing community of practice. And as I've started to engage more with the international simulation community, I realized we can do so much with so little. And we actually have a lot to teach the world about. We don't need these multi-million rand mannequins to have huge impact on learners. I think it's a really exciting thing to be growing and developing as we watch specialties like critical care and anesthesia develop more across the continent, and emergency medicine. It's a great way of creating adaptive and flexible practitioners.
And how you speak about the lack of resources and how adaptable simulation is speaks to a recurrent theme in the podcast that has been mentioned by a few of our guests, saying that something doesn't have to be perfect or to a standard that is accepted elsewhere for it still to be good.
Yes.
And if it is an improvement on what you currently have, then critics shouldn't detract from it or hamper its progress because it is not at a perfect standard.
So just because I'm fresh back from Ghana and have been to one of their memorials. So their first president, one of his most famous quotes is, "Those who judge us merely by the heights we have achieved would do well to remember the depths from which we started." And I think that's, exactly what you're talking about, is how we're not on an even footing when it comes to the resources that we have in our setting and the demand. And things like how we adapt our practice to make sure that everyone has access to high quality teaching experiences is important. And there's ways we can innovate by doing things like student-led simulation. It's a well-established global practice. Patient partner programs, like what used to run at the UCT Skills Lab, is there were patients who were trained up and paid to be part of a medical student's experience and would give them feedback about, well, when you did that, it made me feel a little uncomfortable. So I think, we have a lot to learn from each other about what we can do well with what we have and what we need.
So obviously you run these courses and you have put a lot of time and research, and it's become your career to teach people how to do simulation. And there's a lot of science behind it. But if somebody just wanted to start before attending one of these courses or doing any more formal training, could they just do it? Could they get their team together and say, okay, guys, instead of doing a morning teaching this week, we are doing a simulation, and we're going to do a case. And if they did want to do that, how would you suggest that they go about it, and what would you say is the bare minimum of preparation one needs to do that?
So I think, I'm a little bit biased. I think that there's a lot of assumption about competency in medicine.
Yes.
That just because you are clinically competent doesn't mean that you have a lot of training around how to teach. And so I would encourage people who are considering teaching to seek some kind of education. Honestly, there's plenty on YouTube about how to design a good simulation. But I think also, you and I are moving towards talking about open education resources. If you want to run a sim, go on the internet and Google, I want to run an anaphylaxis simulation for adults. And you will find tons and tons of free resources of pre-made simulation scenarios. A good simulation scenario, one that is done well, takes time and various iterations to make sure that you are doing it well.
Yeah.
The things I would say if you were just keen to give it a go would be, one, to be curious and gentle, to set up very clear expectations for your learners about how they should perform in the space, and to try and keep things realistic. Let them give IV fluid and drugs and let it respond in the same time. And three, not to focus on the equipment. We have run lots of really successful learning events used in theatres in rural Eastern Cape, using blown up gloves with a face drawn on it as the face and rolled up blankets as the arms, and a very simple, I think 39 Rand app called SimMon, which we can link on a tablet as a vital signs monitor, or just pieces of paper with vital signs written on them, and done unexpected difficult airway simulations. And it worked just fine. It's not about the equipment. It's about how you facilitate, and about not just giving feedback, being curious.
So before we move on to open education, have you got any stories or anecdotes or data suggesting how well simulation training does work?
Yeah, maybe I'll tell two quick stories. One will be about the clinical impact, and the other one will be about the effect of stress on our performance. So in my current role, I run a critical care simulation program, and we have a diversity of registrars who rotate into the ICU for 3 months. They start at different points. And many years ago, the ICU started a program of tracheostomy simulations, helping teams of interdisciplinary healthcare providers ranging from nurses, junior doctors, and senior registrars to approach tracheostomy emergencies, run in situ either once a week or part of our 12-week simulation program. And when those simulation scenarios are run, the number of adverse events and deaths from tracheostomy emergencies, mostly blocked trachees, goes from 1 every 4 to 6 weeks in our ICU units to almost 0. During COVID, when we weren't able to run the scenarios, that number crept up really quickly. And then in the second instance, an example of stress was in my previous job working at the Air Mercy Service, we built a helicopter simulator. And we were trying to help teams, mostly pairs, of doctors and paramedics of varying ranges of experience to learn how to function in restricted spaces and under stress. And so we would put them in the simulator where they would sit in a chair with a seatbelt on and a headset with a patient next to them. And the scenario we started orientation with was a disassembled BVM in the drawer. And that was the only equipment they had. And the patient would stop breathing. And in this confined space, under stress, with the sound of a helicopter coming through their headsets, they had to, as a pair, reassemble the BVM. And I never in 3 years saw a team do it in under 3 minutes, because the combination of an unfamiliar space and being a little bit stressed meant that they didn't function at their best. Their communication wasn't at its best. I mean, it's a great way to illustrate how we can use simulation to help people function and communicate better when they're feeling a bit under pressure.
And the only other way in which you would be smooth in that operation would be if you had experienced it in real life, and not everybody has experience when they start, and even experienced providers might just never have happened to them.
Assumed competency is our current education model where we make our mistakes on patients. And so we have a colloquial way of describing what simulation is. And we say, coined by Rowan Dace, it's learning from experience without harm to patient, which is perfectly different to how a lot of us learned.
So your work with the SHARE initiative combines simulation and open education. But let's move on to a more general topic about open education in itself. Let's start by asking, what is open education?
So anyone who's tried to purchase undergraduate medical school textbooks will know that resources are expensive and it's hard to get access to the things we need. So open education is an answer to that, about creating access to education resources through various licensing models. So they may be free to use and change, or they may be just free to use for non-commercial purposes. And I think that the FOMED movement, which is maybe a term not used so much anymore, but free open access medical education started out at the same time badEM started out, which was blogs and podcasts and free events. And I think
And
YouTube, yeah, absolutely. I think the purpose is to give people access to high quality information and learning resources, but also to have the ability to adapt it to context and make sure that what you're learning is what you need to learn to function at your best where you are.
Across the board, there are so many different resources available across all different healthcare sectors in terms of free resources to use online across many different platforms, from TikTok to free journals to podcasts, etc. And from personal experience, the quality control of that can be a bit tricky, because we tend to trust other people's quality control in terms of trusting the source of the podcast, for example. So MCRIT or EM cases are well renowned, they're reputable, and we naturally trust what they are saying and trust that they have checked and peer reviewed their own things. But how, from your perspective, from somebody who is producing free material, how do you do that in a careful way?
No, I think careful and responsible is exactly what we're trying to do, right? So I think that some of the bigger blogs do a great job of leading by example by having peer-reviewed blogs. I think that that's an important thing. Peer review doesn't mean anything other than it's been checked for quality and for rigor. And it's definitely something we've tried to embody at badEM is not the idea that it's persona-based medicine and opinion-based, right? Maybe I can talk about the experience of a book that we published last year as a way to grapple with this question. So last year we published an open access online textbook called Understanding Pain. And the way that we dealt with quality there was we assembled multidisciplinary groups of authors from different settings and backgrounds. So some from primary healthcare and some from tertiary. In our primary healthcare section, we have physios, nurses, and doctors. In our emergency medicine section, we have paramedics, nurses, and doctors, and physios, and so just to make sure that there's varying views on a topic. And that was our form of peer review, so that we had an author group that could kind of fight it out a little bit.
And read each other's work.
Yes.
And make sure nobody's speaking complete hogwash.
Yeah, and lots of feedback. So that was the one part, is I think that if you assemble groups of authors from diverse backgrounds, you're set up for success. And then we went through a formal publication process with the UCT library. So you can get ISBNs and DOIs online and from the National Library Service in South Africa. And ours is published online through the UCT library and licensed as a Creative Commons, but a non-derivative. And so normal open education resources won't have a non-derivative restriction. We chose a non-derivative restriction, which means our content cannot be changed without our permission. And it's good practice to write an explanation of your licensing in whatever resource you write, because ours is centered on patient stories. So we had actual people trust us with their stories, and they could choose to be co-authors or not. And we didn't edit their words. You can, they're alive on the page. You can hear them talking. But we thought that we owed them the recognition, but also they had trusted us with a precious thing. They had trusted us with a story of when they were deeply vulnerable and in pain. And so we didn't want that to be altered or changed. And so I think that that's just an example of how licensing can also be contextual. And I think in our field, perhaps you don't want people to challenge the facts. You're a leading scientist in your area, and you want to say, I know that this is leading science, and I'm trying to bust some myths here, so I'm going to go for this kind of a license. But yeah, it's a really exciting thing that I would encourage people to try, because one of the things that is exciting about it is from creation to publication is quite quick. So textbooks can take prolonged periods of time in the traditional format to go from finished to actually at the readers. Whereas an online textbook, it took a social media campaign to get us over 10,000 downloads in a matter of weeks. And we've had downloads in over 90 countries now. So I think that's the joy of open education, is that accessibility. And we chose to write it in an accessible form of English, so that it read like a conversation. And we aimed it at undergraduate students, but it's now being used in postgraduate and in service learning because there wasn't a similar resource. And I think that, open education is exciting, and I can talk about it for a very long time.
How does one deal with this concept from a more traditional institution point of view? For a completely hypothetical example, let's use the medical school in Blantyre in Malawi.
And that's where I grew up, so good choice.
You've got a class, you've got a medical school, you've got a lecturer, you've got a class, you've got a traditionally prescribed textbook, which is obviously expensive. Well, maybe not obviously, but which is likely expensive. And then you've got an ever increasing array of different platforms to get information. Say you've got a Harvard physiology lecturer who's made it big on TikTok and he explains things nicely. So now you've got your traditional avenue, but the whole class is watching this professor on TikTok. How does the university deal with that? Do they endorse that? I suppose there's still a test to standardize the knowledge gained at the end and to make sure that everybody has gained the knowledge that you want them to gain, but it's still tricky to navigate that from a teaching perspective. For example, I learned physiology at university through YouTube, a guy called Armando Hasunagan. I really like the fact that you can go back and forth, and the visual and the drawings and everything just really worked for me. But now there's countless amounts of things.
So I think this is, the central part of why open education is important. And the question is, why are they not choosing the traditional texts? Well, it may not be written in a way that is easy for them to interpret into practice. It may be unaffordable to them. It may actually not meet their needs. And so I think one of the challenges that open education is hoping to rise to is to create adaptable resources that are for African healthcare providers or for, we don't necessarily have the same needs as high income country practitioners. So I think that is the joy of open education, is that it is a bit more accessible. And I think the concept of control is also difficult. If we think of how we're moving towards competency-based rather than, if we think of like surgical registrars within the South African setting, I know they're working on workplace-based assessment. So how competent you are
On a daily
basis is a lot more important than what you can recite to me from a textbook. And I think that's really exciting. Another great example of this is Johan Fagan's book of head and neck surgery, which has over 500,000 downloads all over the world. And, I ask myself, would 500,000 people, would they have bought a textbook?
Yeah.
And who needs to own knowledge? Who needs to, I think we're at an interesting juncture in academia where there's pushbacks against the idea that we pay to publish, but we peer review for free. Yeah. And, these kinds of things. And I think it kind of fits along the same stream of we must ask ourselves, why do we need to profit from knowledge? Yeah. I completely understand why. But, I think that this is it. We are of a generation who is challenging the status quo and asking, if we challenge it in a wider way, what will we come out with, which is more equitable and accessible for the people who need it?
I also think that as time moves on, it will become naturally more difficult to profit from medical knowledge or any sort of knowledge, really. If you think about how we share knowledge and how it's available in different sources. I mean, at university, we would all photocopy each other's notes. We would photocopy each other's textbooks. We'd send pictures to each other. So you take a paid for resource like a textbook and then you share it amongst your friends. And now with the amount of sharing platforms and social media platforms and clouds and all sorts of things like that, that sharing capacity becomes infinite. So the ability to regulate who's paid for it and who hasn't becomes a lot more difficult.
Totally.
And I think that will almost morph it more towards a free and open access market, as opposed, and then if people gain enough of a reputation or a following, then they can produce new content or new material that they can then decide to charge for should they want to. But I don't think it's going to be easy to charge for a resource off the bat.
I don't think we're eradicating a market by creating open education materials. There are lots of people who still want to buy dense medical textbooks, not going to be changed. But I think that higher education and in-service learning needs to be more accessible. And as knowledge changes and adapts, it's much easier for open access online materials to adapt than it is to revise a gigantic set of textbooks and encyclopedias,
I completely agree. Tell us about the Dot4D initiative.
So the Dot4D initiative belongs to the Centre for Innovation in Learning and Teaching at the University of Cape Town. And it's a wonderful group of academics and researchers who are trying their very best to promote the use of open education materials and understand the use of open education materials in the Global South. I got involved with them through sheer luck. We managed to land a wonderful grant to write an open access simulation textbook, which is the project we're currently busy with. And we're busy studying the use of open access resources in health education, in the partners that we're writing the textbook with. And it's really interesting to me how the traditional view of education is really hard to shake, and how challenging it's been for some people that we're writing a free book, because even as sometimes as authors, we think that it doesn't have quite the same credibility, or and yet I've got more emails and letters from people around our open access pain textbook than I have ever got from any of the traditionally published articles I've written. So it's an interesting journey.
Academic journals tend not to be free.
Yeah.
Some are.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of people in academia read journals, as it is the space that they're in, but the people working in clinical medicine either don't have time for them, which is made worse by the fact that you have to pay for them. So I feel like a lot of the time they don't actually reach the ears of the clinician because of those reasons. And there's probably data on the exact numbers, and I could be completely wrong, but that is just the feeling that I get.
Completely. So if you're outside of academia and it's not an open access publication, how are you going to access it, firstly? Yeah. But I think that there's also something here around education needs to move forward, right? Like linking back to the article about CPR and representation of women and people of color in the mannequins available on the market. We published, my co-authors did a really magnificent job of getting it into the news on 3 continents, and it was in the conversation. And you know that some very well-followed person on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok picked up our article and made a video about it. And it's had over 1 million views. And so actually the article itself was only a part of the work. It's the science communication, which has been absolutely gigantic. And yeah, it's not a licensed form of open education, but I think that's tying into the conversation of why is it important? Well, we have an audience to reach, and that audience may not be reading traditional text.
Last question. If you had a magic wand, what would be the one thing that you would want to materialize in African healthcare tomorrow?
I would love to see simulation embedded better in undergraduate, postgraduate, and in-service learning. And that magic wand would create a culture of healthcare practitioners who learn how to communicate and work in teams and interdisciplinary teams, practitioners who are reflexive and able to say, I don't think that was my best effort, and I would like to try and understand why, instead of a community of people who are just going to work every day and trying to survive the 12 hours. It would be magical to me to shift our mindsets towards how do we improve ourselves and our teams and our systems, rather than how do we punish each other for our perceived mistakes.
Or punish yourself.
how do I go home and punish myself for perceived mistakes? So that would be my dream.
I think that's all. Thank you so much for that conversation. I found it very interesting to hear about all of the work that you are doing and all of the interesting viewpoints you have on healthcare at large and education at large. And also thank you for starting badEM in the first place all those years ago.
Thanks, Dan, for your hard work. It's really exciting to see this new direction that badEM has taken.
That's all for this episode, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. Just to summarize, we discussed what simulation is, how it has been shown to be beneficial in the past, and the many different areas that it can be used successfully. We then moved on to the sharing of educational resources, obviously involved with simulation, but then we discussed the broader open access movement and how that is reshaping medical education all over the world, but particularly in lower resource settings. And that's that. Be sure to review and subscribe on all of your main platforms, and to send to a friend or a colleague who might be interested. If you want to get in touch, find me on LinkedIn or email me at dan@badem.co.za. Please also follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Brave African Discussions, and X or Blue Sky as badEM. Thanks for listening. See you all next month. Bye bye.